I work at a diner off the road between Carson City and Reno. For privacy reasons, I'll call it the Lone Star Diner, but that's not its real name. The reason I'm vague about the details will make sense later, but for now, let's just say the place isn't ordinary. Why do I work here? That's a good question, but the answer is simple. Life didn't go the way I planned. I was supposed to graduate, land a great job, and build a stable life. Instead, here I am, stuck in a diner that feels like it belongs in the middle of nowhere. If you're working at a diner after college, especially one off a lonely highway, it usually means things aren't going great for you. But out of all the diners in the area, why this one? There are at least 10 other diners within a 30-minute drive, all offering the same basic menu of coffee, breakfast platters, and greasy comfort food. Most of them pay just above minimum wage. This diner, however, pays $50 an hour. Yes, you heard that right, $50 an hour. For a job that doesn't require a degree or years of experience, that kind of pay feels unreal. Naturally, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. Still, there's a reason the pay is so high, and it's not just about attracting staff. There's one rule that sets this diner apart, one rule that can't be ignored. My first day on the job felt like any other restaurant gig. I'd worked in customer service before, so I wasn't too worried. Dealing with people, juggling orders, and staying on my feet all day weren't new to me. I figured the biggest challenge would be adjusting to the diner's quirks. Every workplace has them, after all. At the Lone Star Diner, the rules were a little strange. They weren't written down anywhere, but you learned them quickly enough. For example, some parts of the restaurant had to be spotless at all times. The boss, Melanie, was obsessed with keeping those areas clean. Other spots? She didn't care at all. Customers were another story. You had to serve them quickly, but not too quickly. Melanie explained it like this: people come here to slow down, not to rush. Give them a moment to settle in. Most of the regulars looked like they'd been through hard times. They didn't come here for the food or the company. They came for solitude. Even the kitchen had its own unwritten rules. The cooks weren't expected to whip up gourmet dishes. Instead, they had to aim for a peculiar standard of mediocrity. Not terrible, but not great either. The idea was to serve food that was just good enough to keep people coming back, but plain enough to match the atmosphere. As strange as it all sounded, I adjusted quickly. I wasn't there to reinvent the wheel. I just wanted to do my job, collect my paycheck, and go home. If the diner wanted perfection in mediocrity, I was their person. Most customers didn't want much: a cup of coffee, some eggs and toast, and the occasional piece of pie. My job was to serve it at a steady pace, check in occasionally, and leave them alone. After a few weeks, I felt like I'd found my rhythm. The job wasn't hard, and I even started to enjoy the quiet. The customers were polite, my coworkers were friendly, and Melanie, though strict, wasn't a bad boss. For the first time in a while, I felt like I had a place where I could park my life and figure things out. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the pay. $50 an hour for waiting tables was almost too good to be true. I couldn't help but wonder why Melanie was willing to pay so much for such a simple job. One day, during a lull in the shift, I decided to ask her. She was standing at the register, counting out bills with methodical precision. "Melanie," I began, trying to sound casual, "can I ask you something?" She didn't look up. "What is it?" "Why $50 an hour? It's way more than any other diner pays." She paused, her fingers hovering over the cash. Then she sighed and said, "I told you on your first day, it's about following the rules. And when it's an important rule, you'd better follow it perfectly." I raised an eyebrow. "High expectations, huh?" She finally looked up, fixing me with a stern gaze. "You think I'm joking?" "No," I replied quickly. "Good," she said, "because I'm not. If you can't follow the rules here, every single one, then you shouldn't stay. I'll even pay you for the week if you want to quit now. No hard feelings." Her words left me unsettled. I didn't know what rule she was talking about, but I didn't want to push my luck. I nodded and went back to work, deciding it was best to keep my head down and focus on the job. As the weeks went by, life settled into a routine. I'd get up early, work my shift, and go home to my small apartment. The diner was quiet most of the time, and I liked it that way. The road outside was long and empty, stretching into the horizon like a ribbon of solitude. At night, I'd sit outside and stare at the stars, feeling a strange sense of peace. I wasn't happy exactly, but I wasn't unhappy either. The diner gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: stability. For a while, that was enough. It was a few weeks into my new job when I first noticed something odd. The days had settled into a predictable rhythm. Customers would trickle in, order their meals, and leave without much fuss. The regulars were a quiet bunch, and the occasional travelers passing through were polite but kept to themselves. For the most part, the job was straightforward, until he showed up. It must have been a Saturday, though I can't say for sure. What I do remember is that the diner wasn't particularly busy that day. I had just come out from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of coffee, when I noticed a man sitting in the far corner. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. He looked like any other diner customer, mid-50s, wearing a brown corduroy shirt, short hair neatly combed. He had a calm demeanor, his hands folded neatly on the table, and a faint smile on his face. But there was something about him that felt off. I couldn't remember seeing him walk in, which was strange because the bell above the door always chimed when someone entered. He didn't have a menu in front of him, nor did he seem to be waiting for service. He just sat there, looking content and patient, as if he had all the time in the world. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started walking toward his table. That's when I felt a sharp grip on my arm. The voice was firm and unmistakable. It was Melanie. Her hand tightened around my forearm, and I nearly dropped the coffee pot I was holding. "What?" I began, but she cut me off. "Do you remember what we talked about?" she asked, her tone low and serious. I blinked, confused. "The rules?" She nodded, her eyes narrowing. "This is the most important one." She gestured toward the man in the corner. He was still sitting there, perfectly still, with that faint, almost amused smile on his face. "That man," Melanie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't go near him. You don't talk to him. You don't take his order. You don't even acknowledge him unless it's absolutely necessary. But he's a customer." Her grip tightened, and I winced as her nails dug into my skin. "I mean it," she said, her voice icy. "You don't approach him. You don't speak to him. Do you understand?" I stared at her, my heart pounding. Melanie wasn't usually this intense. Sure, she could be strict, but this was something else. She looked genuinely afraid. "Okay," I said finally, my voice barely audible. She released my arm and straightened up, smoothing her apron as if nothing had happened. "Good," she said. "Just trust me on this. It's for your own good." With that, she walked back to the register, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't stop glancing at the man in the corner. He didn't move much, didn't call out for service, didn't do anything out of the ordinary. He just sat there, his expression calm and his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. I wanted to ask Melanie about him, who he was, why he was here, what the big deal was, but every time I worked up the nerve, I saw the look in her eyes and thought better of it. Whatever was going on, it was clear that I wasn't supposed to know. The man left eventually, though I didn't see him go. One moment he was there, and the next he wasn't. The bell above the door never chimed, and no one saw him get up from his seat. It was as if he had simply vanished. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in the corner. There was something about him that didn't make sense, something that didn't belong. I told myself to forget about it, to focus on the job and not ask questions. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The next time he showed up, I tried to ignore him. I went about my shift as usual, pouring coffee, taking orders, and clearing tables. But I could feel his presence, like a weight in the room. It was hard not to glance in his direction, and every time I did, I found him looking back at me, his calm smile never faltering. Melanie kept an even closer watch during these visits, her eyes darting between the man and the staff, as if she were waiting for someone to make a mistake. She didn't have to say it, her expression said it all. "Don't break the rule." I started to notice a pattern. The man would appear at the end of each month, always sitting in the same corner, always wearing the same brown corduroy shirt. He never ordered anything, never interacted with the other customers, and never caused a scene. He was just there. Whenever he showed up, the atmosphere in the diner changed. The regulars seemed to grow quieter, their eyes downcast as if they were trying to pretend he didn't exist. Even the cooks in the back seemed on edge, their voices hushed and their movements more deliberate. I tried to keep my head down and focus on my work, but the questions wouldn't stop nagging at me. Who was he? Why did Melanie seem so scared of him? And why was it so important to avoid him? One day, I couldn't hold back any longer. As Melanie walked past me, I leaned in and whispered, "What's the deal with that guy?" Her expression darkened, and she shook her head. "Don't ask," she said. "But if you're scared, you can quit," she said, cutting me off. "No one will blame you." Her words left me feeling more unsettled than ever. I wasn't scared, at least not yet, but I was starting to wonder if maybe I should be. Weeks passed, and the strange routine at the Lone Star Diner continued. By now, I had fully settled into the job. I knew the rhythm of the shifts, the preferences of the regulars, and the peculiarities of the unwritten rules. But there was always one shadow over it all, the man in the corner. He showed up like clockwork, his presence an unsettling fixture at the end of each month. The way the staff and even the customers seemed to tiptoe around him was unnerving. Nobody ever talked about him directly, just a shared glance or a whispered acknowledgement when he arrived. Even the occasional state troopers or suits that stopped by seemed to avoid him, though I noticed they watched him closely, jotting things down in notebooks as if conducting some sort of study. Despite Melanie's warnings and my better judgment, I couldn't shake my curiosity. The man didn't seem dangerous. He never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn, never so much as lifted a hand in agitation. He just sat there, calm and content, as if he belonged. It wasn't long before I tried to push the boundaries. One month, when Melanie was out sick, I decided to test the waters. It was a Thursday, and the diner was quieter than usual. The other staff were busy with their tasks, and no one was paying much attention to me. The man was sitting in his usual spot, his hands folded neatly on the table and that familiar faint smile on his face. I cleared my throat and called out, "Hello, sir. What brings you here?" The words felt heavy as they left my mouth, as if I'd crossed an invisible line. The other waitstaff froze, their heads snapping up to look at me with wide eyes. A couple of customers glanced over, confused by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The man turned his head slowly, his expression unchanged. He put a hand to his ear, as if he hadn't heard me clearly. "I'm sorry, dear," he said, his voice calm and polite. "What was that?" His voice caught me off guard. I don't know what I was expecting, something deep and menacing, maybe, or strange and otherworldly. Instead, it was ordinary, almost comforting. I hesitated, then raised my voice slightly. I said, "What brings you here?" The man chuckled softly, a sound that somehow felt both warm and unsettling. "I'm afraid I didn't catch that. Would you mind coming over here and saying it again?" His words sent a chill down my spine. There was nothing overtly threatening in his tone, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. It felt like a trap, like he was daring me to break the one rule Melanie had drilled into us. "No, that's okay," I said quickly, turning back toward the other customers. The man didn't press the issue. He simply returned to his quiet, patient demeanor, as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The rest of my shift was a blur, my mind racing with questions and unease. When Melanie returned the next day, I didn't tell her what I had done. Part of me felt guilty for disobeying her, but another part of me was frustrated. I wanted answers. Who was this man? Why was everyone so afraid of him? And why did he keep coming back? The weeks that followed offered no clarity. The man continued to appear at the end of each month, always in the same spot, always with the same calm smile. The tension in the diner was palpable whenever he was there, but no one ever addressed it directly. It wasn't until I overheard one of Melanie's private conversations that I started to piece things together. She was sitting at a back table with a man in a sharp suit, his earpiece glinting under the fluorescent lights. I was wiping down the counter nearby, trying not to look like I was eavesdropping. "How long has she been working here?" the man asked in a low, gruff voice. 6 months, Melanie replied. And you trust her? Yes, she said firmly. The man didn't look convinced. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room. You've told her about him? Melanie hesitated. Not everything. She knows the rules. The man's expression darkened. That's not enough. You know what happens when people get curious? I felt a chill run down my spine. Were they talking about me? She's fine, Melanie said, though her voice wavered slightly. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice further. I couldn't hear what he said next, but Melanie's reaction told me enough. Her face went pale and she nodded stiffly. The conversation ended shortly after that, and the man left without another word. Melanie didn't say anything to me, but the tension between us lingered for days. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but I held back. Whatever was going on, it was clear that I wasn't supposed to know. One thing was certain, the man in the corner wasn't just an ordinary customer. He was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in a place like this, or maybe something that belonged here too much. As much as I tried to ignore it, the truth was becoming harder to avoid. This wasn't just a diner, and this wasn't just a job. Time at the Lone Star Diner seemed to slip into an odd rhythm. Most days were ordinary. Customers came and went, orders were filled, and the quiet hum of small-town life carried on. But at the end of each month, everything changed. That was when he would appear. The man in the corner had become a strange constant, like the moon rising on a clear night. I had started to anticipate his arrival, even though it was never announced. He'd show up at the usual time, take his usual seat, and sit in his usual posture, hands folded neatly on the table, faint smile on his face, and eyes that seemed to see through everything and everyone. Melanie had told me to follow the rules, to not ask questions, and to never approach him. And I had obeyed for the most part. But my curiosity hadn't gone away. It had only grown stronger. Every time he showed up, I found myself wondering about him, watching him from across the room and trying to piece together his mystery. It wasn't just me who was affected by his presence. Everyone in the diner seemed to feel it. The customers spoke in hushed tones, and the other staff moved more carefully, as if afraid to draw attention to themselves. Even the state troopers and agents who occasionally visited the diner acted differently when he was around. They didn't interact with him directly, but I noticed the way they kept glancing at him, scribbling notes in their little notebooks. One day, Melanie called me into the back room for a meeting. She wasn't alone. Sitting across from her was a man in a sharp suit, his demeanor cold and calculating. The table was cluttered with papers, files, and what looked like surveillance photos, though I couldn't make out the details. "This is her?" the man asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked me over. Melanie nodded. "She's been here 6 months?" The man frowned. "And you think she can handle it?" "I do," Melanie said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Handle what?" I asked, my unease growing. The man ignored my question. Instead, he leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Tell me," he said, "what do you know about the man in the corner?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Not much," I admitted. "I know we're not supposed to talk to him or take his order." "Good," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Keep it that way." Melanie cleared her throat. "She's been good about following the rules," she said. "I trust her." The man didn't look convinced. "It's not just about following the rules," he said. "It's about understanding the stakes." He pulled a file from the stack on the table and slid it toward me. I glanced at Melanie, who gave me a reluctant nod. I opened the file and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside were photos, grainy and unsettling, of people who had once worked at the diner. I recognized a few of the faces, though I couldn't recall their names. Each photo was accompanied by a brief report detailing their disappearances. "Each of these individuals broke the rule," the man said, his tone flat and emotionless. "Each of them thought they could handle it. They were wrong." My stomach churned as I flipped through the pages. The reports were vague, but the implications were clear. Whatever happened to these people, it wasn't natural. "What is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression didn't change. "That's classified," he said. "All you need to know is that he's dangerous." And if you value your life, you'll stay as far away from him as possible. The meeting ended shortly after that, leaving me with more questions than answers. I returned to the dining area, my mind racing. The photos and reports haunted me, and the man's warning echoed in my head. For a while, I tried to push it all aside, to focus on my work and pretend that everything was normal. But normal didn't exist at the Lone Star Diner. Not anymore. It was during one of the man's monthly visits that things finally came to a head. Melanie had fallen ill, a rare occurrence that left the rest of us scrambling to cover her duties. Without her watchful eye, the atmosphere in the diner felt different, looser. The man arrived at his usual time, taking his usual seat in the corner. The other staff steered clear of him as always, but I noticed a few sideways glances and whispered comments. Without Melanie there to enforce the rules, the tension in the diner seemed to rise. One of my coworkers, a young guy named Malcolm, was new to the job. He had only been working at the diner for a week, but he was eager to prove himself. He was the kind of guy who threw himself into every task, always looking for ways to help out. When he saw the man sitting alone in the corner, his instincts kicked in. He grabbed a notepad and started walking toward the table. I felt my heart stop. "Malcolm," I hissed, grabbing his arm. He turned to me, confused. "What? He looks like he's been waiting for service." "You can't," I said, my voice shaking. "You can't talk to him. You can't take his order. You can't go near him." Malcolm frowned. "Why not? He's a customer, isn't he? Just trust me," I said, tightening my grip on his arm. "It's the rule. You can't break it." He hesitated, glancing back at the man. "That's ridiculous," he muttered, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he sighed and walked toward the kitchen, leaving the man in the corner untouched. But the damage was done. The man's faint smile widened, his gaze following Malcolm as he disappeared into the back. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The shift had been quiet after Malcolm's near mistake, but the air in the diner felt heavier than ever. The man in the corner stayed in his usual spot, his calm smile never faltering. He seemed more amused than usual, though, like he had overheard a joke no one else was in on. I kept my distance, replaying the moment with Malcolm over and over in my head. Had I stopped him in time? Had he done something to break the rule without realizing it? The man hadn't spoken or moved, but there was something different about his presence that night, something I couldn't quite place. By the time the diner closed, I was exhausted. The other staff had already left, leaving me to finish cleaning up and lock the doors. The man was gone, as always, without the sound of the doorbell or the sight of him walking out. His table was empty, but the faint imprint of his presence seemed to linger, like a shadow that refused to fade. The next morning, Melanie was back. She looked pale and tired, but her usual sharpness had returned. She didn't ask about the man's visit or mention Malcolm's close call. It was as if the whole thing had never happened, though I could tell she knew. "Morning," she said curtly as I walked in. "We've got a busy day ahead. Get to it?" I nodded and got to work, grateful for the distraction. But the reprieve didn't last long. It was mid-afternoon when the bell above the door chimed, and a man in a sharp suit walked in. I recognized him immediately, one of the agents who frequented the diner during the man's visits. His presence usually signaled trouble, and today was no exception. He approached Melanie at the counter, leaning in to speak to her in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the look on Melanie's face told me enough. Her lips thinned, and her eyes darted toward me, then toward the back where Malcolm was. After a moment, she straightened up and walked over to where I was wiping down a table. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. I followed her to the back room, where the agent was waiting. He gestured for me to sit, his expression unreadable. "Is this about Malcolm?" I asked, my stomach twisting with dread. The agent didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a file on the table and slid it toward me. "Do you know where he is?" he asked finally. I frowned, confused. "He's in the kitchen. Or at least he was." The agent shook his head. "He's not. He left last night, didn't clock out, and hasn't been seen since." My blood ran cold. "That's not possible," I said. "I saw him." "You saw him leave the diner," the agent interrupted, his tone sharp. But did you see him after that? Did you talk to him? I shook my head, unable to find the words. Melanie sighed, running a hand through her hair. He was new, she said softly, as if that explained everything. The agent's gaze hardened. That's not an excuse, he said. You were supposed to prepare him, to make sure he understood the rules. I tried, Melanie said, her voice rising slightly. But he didn't listen. He thought he knew better. The tension in the room was suffocating. I wanted to say something to defend Melanie or Malcolm or myself, but I didn't know where to start. What happened to him? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The agent's expression didn't change. He's gone, he said simply. Gone where? The agent exchanged a glance with Melanie, then leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. That's classified, he said. The meeting ended shortly after that, leaving me with more questions than answers. I returned to the dining area, my mind racing. Malcolm's absence was a void that couldn't be ignored, and the agent's cryptic words only made it worse. For the next few days, the diner felt emptier than usual. The other staff avoided talking about Malcolm, as if saying his name might summon whatever had taken him. The regulars noticed the shift in the atmosphere but didn't ask questions. They just came, ate, and left in silence. It wasn't until the man in the corner returned that things came to a head. It was late at night, near the end of my shift, when he walked through the front door for the first time. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He had never entered so openly before, and the sight of him standing there, his calm smile directed at me, was enough to make my blood run cold. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and polite. I didn't respond. My throat felt tight, and my legs refused to move. He walked up to the counter, each step slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly in front of me. He was taller than I had realized, his presence overwhelming despite his calm demeanor. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his smile widening slightly. "For your curiosity?" I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. "What do you want?" His eyes sparkled with amusement. "Just a conversation," he said. "You've been wondering about me, haven't you?" I shook my head quickly, but he laughed softly. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I have my own rules, you see, and I never break them." I didn't believe him. Everything about him radiated danger, from the way he spoke to the way he moved. But I couldn't bring myself to look away. "Why are you here?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. His smile widened, and for a moment, his expression seemed almost kind. "Because it's fun," he said simply. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he had appeared. It wasn't until I noticed the box on the counter that I realized he had left something behind. My hands shook as I opened it, and when I saw what was inside, I nearly collapsed. Malcolm's severed head stared back at me, his expression blank and lifeless. Around him, a crude arrangement of flowers had been placed, as if the man had attempted to create a bouquet but didn't quite understand how. A note was tucked inside, written in childlike handwriting. "I brought him back just like you wished." The room spun, and I stumbled backward, clutching the counter for support. The reality of what I was dealing with hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a diner, and he wasn't just a man. This was something far beyond my understanding, something I could never escape. The room spun, and I stumbled backward, clutching the counter for support. The reality of what I was dealing with hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a diner, and he wasn't just a man. This was something far beyond my understanding, something I could never escape. I wanted to scream, to run, to quit and never look back. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The man in the corner, the rules, the disappearances, they weren't just part of the diner. They were part of something much larger, something that had no boundaries. As I locked the doors that night, the stars above seemed colder, more distant. I felt the weight of the empty sky pressing down on me, a reminder that there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And yet, here I am, sharing this story with you. Not because I think it will save me, it's too late for that, but because I think you deserve to know. If you're ever traveling between Carson City and Reno and happen to spot a diner on the side of the road, do yourself a favor, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't get curious. And if you ever see a man sitting alone in the corner of a quiet diner, smiling as if he knows something you don't approach him. Don't talk to him. Don't even look at him for too long. Remember my story. And remember the rule. If you enjoyed this tale, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to hear more unsettling stories from the edges of the unknown. You never know what else might be lurking in the shadows of our world, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Stay curious, but stay safe.